name is Dr. Jessie Morgan-Owens. I am a Louisiana native, 7th generation, and my research has been predominantly on 19th century America and the campaign to abolish slavery in the United States. And part of my interest in that came out of photography. My first career was as a photographer, and I was interested in how photography could be used politically in its very earliest stages. So when photography was invented in 1839, it was immediately utilized by abolitionists. Frederick Douglass is one of the preeminent photography theorists. A lot of his writing on photography remains only in manuscript, but it is out there and people are starting to publish on it, and it's pretty fascinating work. And so that was the beginning of my project here. Anything else I can tell you about? I'm the dean of Bart Early College, which is an initiative here in New Orleans and 9 other cities in the United States to bring high quality liberal arts college level coursework to high school juniors and seniors to try and cure senioritis, but also to give them a legs up so that they can enter into college with between 25 and 60 college credits. We have a half-day program and a full-day program. And I've been working with that project for 7 years now, and we've really seen it grown into something absolutely gorgeous. I also will mention that I am a teacher at that school, and I spend most of my afternoons on Zoom with 16 and 17 and 18-year-olds. So if you need to interrupt me or drop something in the chat, I can handle it. There's literally nothing on Zoom that's going to throw me at this point, knock on wood. So if you don't know how to use the chat, that is really the best way to ask a question as I'm speaking. It's at the bottom of your screen. There's a little thing that looks like a cartoon circle with the, for speaking. And I'm just gonna say, I'm gonna type in here, hello. So she'll pop up and so I can see it there. And that will be the best way to get in touch with me in the middle of the conversation. One of the things that I learned on book tour is that most people have an extraordinary working knowledge of the 19th century, and that I don't really need to go into a lot of detail about what was happening in 1856 or 55. But that said, if you have a question that would help your understanding of what I am saying, by all means. And one of the things that's really interesting about my project for me is that I'm working with a story that nobody else knows. I am the person who helped to bring Mary Mildred Williams into the spotlight. Myself and Mary Now Mitchell, who's also a scholar here in New Orleans, have done a lot of research into her story, but otherwise she's relatively unknown as a figure in history. And so do not be embarrassed to drop a note in the chat. Like I said, it's not easy to throw me. And so I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have. The layout for today for my talk will be a couple of moments of a few more introductory comments, and then I will give you an overview of the story behind Mary Mildred Williams and do a short reading of a moment of encounter between Mary and Senator Charles Sumner, which was the beginning of her moment in the public eye. And then I might do a little bit of show and tell, because I am in my house and I have all kinds of cool objects like daguerreotypes and handwriting by some of these abolitionists and the people who were involved in the story. Then I'll open it up to questions, because frankly, if you're here to talk about the 1850s while doing hurricane prep, while you've got your banana bread baking, I appreciate you so much, and I really want to hear from you. So if you have any questions, just start populating the chat with them now, but also bring them to me at the end of the conversation. I'm going to leave a little more time for questions than usual. Okay, so I'll go ahead and get started unless we have any questions to start.
Nope.
Great. So as I said, my dissertation work was on the impact of photography on the abolition movement in the 1840s and 50s. And I went into the work trying to figure out is it possible for photographic propaganda to begin at the very beginning? One of the thoughts that we had going into it was there was a kind of a weird moment in photography history where we thought that everybody in the 19th century, when they first saw a photograph, just believed everything they saw. And that wasn't the case. Of course, politicians and influencers used photography in a very similar way as us. It is true that photography changed the way that people wrote, thought, saw, and argued in this period in a way that has become commonplace for us. And so it's important to sometimes think about, if you're in the first generation of technology, what that meant for that direction, for that moment. But it's also important to remember that anti-slavery and photography have overlapping histories, and their growing influence and innovative technologies are really developing apace during this period. This daguerreotype that you're going to see here, just one second, let me move my slide forward. The daguerreotype on the left was an extraordinary moment in the innovation of the history of media that has been largely buried and forgotten. Mary's daguerreotype marks the moment when photography first began to make its tenacious claim on our sympathies and our political point of view. And in short, she was America's first poster child. Now, when we think about what it means to be a poster child, that means that your photograph is being circulated in order to make a political point. You become essentially an object, and your story is sort of divorced from you. And you see that happening in the letter that's on the right. That's the moment in which her image was sent to Boston to start making an argument on her behalf. But all of her history and everything about her is forgotten in this moment. And so the work of my research for this book was, it took me about 13 years. I first saw the letter on the right in 2006 and immediately had just a ton of questions. I wondered, first of all, is that daguerreotype still extant? Could I see it? And also, why is she another Ida May? And why would her presence in Boston be more suggestive than another kid's? And all of those questions are coming up for me, but the answers were not found in Sumner's notes, right? The answers are going to be found in her family history, which is a history of sexual enslavement going back 4 generations. Mary Mildred Williams was born in Virginia into a family that was enslaved by the Cornwell family in 1847. And so in order to truly understand her story, I had to go back to her mother and her grandmother and her great-grandmother's stories, because the slavery is matrilineal, and figure out what is happening in this family and what her life story was. And her father also, Seth Botts, escaped to Boston, and through his tireless efforts was able to see his entire family freed. Mary has a sister, her name is Rebecca, and a brother Oscar, who's 10 years old at this time. Also, Seth had her mother Elizabeth, her grandmother Prudence, her aunt Evelina, her uncles Jesse, Ludwell, and Albert all saw manumission because of the efforts of this man. I don't have time today to tell you about all of the adventures and misadventures of all of those people, but I want to look briefly at this one encounter. The first encounter between Mary and Senator Charles Sumner, who wrote this letter and sort of kicked this project into motion. It's on page 100. Here's my book. I have the book. It's page 100 of the hardback. There's a joke that I want to share with you right now, which is that Ford Maddox Ford said that you can tell the quality of any book by looking at page 99, that's where like the heart of it is. And so I opened page 99 and it is blank on my book. So I'm not going to read page 99. I'm going to read page 100, which is the next page, which is the beginning of chapter 8, which is the moment that she enters into the public eye. Charles Sumner was charmed by Mary's older brother, Oscar, when he met him in Washington after their manumission. Oscar, at 10 years old, was bright and intelligent, with the eyes of an eagle and a beautiful smile. When Sumner first met Oscar, he asked, "You are free, young man. Do you know what that means?" Oscar replied, "I now belong to myself." Sumner laughed. "Well, there is a definition which philosophy might borrow." I'm going to fast forward. This is a photograph of Oscar with his sister Mary. So we see Oscar on the right and Mary on the left. And then this is their grandmother, Prudence, who is a huge part of my book, but we're not talking about her at the moment. So on February 13th, Charles Sumner divulged his plan for these children, Henry and Elizabeth's children, Oscar and Mary. He would launch a publicity campaign around Oscar's bright and intelligent little sister, Mary. He chose Mary for her light skin color and her vulnerability to trafficking in the sex trade in young enslaved girls. Sumner sketched out a campaign around Mary's appearance. First, she would be photographed, and then her daguerreotype would travel northward to be copied and displayed. The entire family would be publicly exhibited as they made their way north, first in New York and then in the State House in Boston, where Mary would be presented to the legislature. Sumner would join them in April at the close of the senatorial session. He would present Mary at his lecture in Tremont Temple in May to 6,000 people. In his response, Andrew gave his support to Sumner and said, and John Andrew was the future governor of Massachusetts, "I also feel desirous that members of the legislature shall have a sight of those children." The speed at which Sumner moved on his plan suggests that he intended to act first and ask permission later. So the same day that he sent a letter, the same day that he asked permission to do this and to send this family into the public eye, he sent the letter and the daguerreotype to Dr. James Stone, fully expecting Stone to send that letter to the press. Here's the letter. Washington, February 19th, 1855. Dear Dr. Stone, I send you by the mail the daguerreotype of a child about 7 years old, who only a few months ago was a slave in Virginia, but who is now free by means sent on from Boston, which I had the happiness of being trusted with for this purpose. She is bright and intelligent, another Ida May. I think her presence among us in Boston will be a great deal more effective than any speech I could make. He doesn't really mean this. He was a very arrogant man. But we're going to get back to that. Meanwhile, I send this picture thinking that you will be glad to exhibit it among the members of the legislature as an illustration of slavery. Let a hard-hearted hunker look at it and be softened. I send another copy in a different attitude to John A. Andrew. Her name is Mary. Ever yours, Sumner. P.S. Such is slavery. Should such things be allowed to continue in the city of Washington under the shadow of the Capitol? So I think that it's probably pretty clear in basically in anyone's reading of this letter is that it is full of innuendo and taboo. Why does Sumner joke that Mary's presence among us in Boston will be a great deal more effective than any speech he could make? That is unlikely. As he said, he was a very arrogant man, and he was the senator, the first ever senator to be elected purely on an anti-slavery platform. And his speeches had been selling out for months. But he thought that the exhibition of her daguerreotype alone might be enough to soften hearts and win votes. And there are a lot of missing antecedents here, such as slavery. There it is. That it there doesn't have an antecedent. It doesn't need one. The issue that is at the heart of what we are talking about here is the issue of white sympathy, or how do we get white people in Boston to care about Black people in Virginia? And one of the issues that we face even today, and I say this as a white woman, that I feel that we are talking about race a lot of times as something that we are somehow exempt from, and the we here being a white people, and that this isn't a problem that we're expected to solve. Ooh, my phone is ringing, 1 second. It's my mom calling about the storm. So sorry. So I want to say that, as I was saying, I think that this is a moment where he is a political person who is trying to figure out, how do I get the legislature in Boston to vote at this moment on the very important issues around the fugitive slave law that were coming up at this moment? And how do we get them to vote differently? And I think that one of the things that is really important in the work that I've been doing, not just in this book, but since, is thinking about encounters. There are moments in the historical record that are moments of encounters, moments where one group meets another group, one moment meets another moment. And in this case, we have the moment of when Oscar and Mary meet Charles Sumner. And Charles Sumner has a decision to make in this moment. He is essentially casting a child that he can take a photograph of and send up north to try and convince legislatures to change their votes. And he chooses Mary as a casting decision. But as anti-racists and as people who want to perhaps change the discussion around race, we have to think about, how do we solve those encounters differently? How do we think about that encounter differently? What could Sumner have done differently in this moment that took the measure of the culture in which he's speaking to, but also somehow considered Oscar as a part of the story? One of the things that I've been working a lot on in this project and in general is thinking about the micro decisions that are made in everyday life that perpetuate a racial hierarchy that has white supremacy at its base. And when we think about what that means, we have this moment where he's choosing between a Black boy and a white girl, and he's choosing the white girl, right? The white presenting girl. Because the story that she can tell at the legislature is slightly different. And he makes a second choice here, which I will be able to talk about only briefly, but I will kind of bring into a little bit, which is the choice to call her another Ida May. Ida May was the title character of a novel that was published that year, and it was actually the bestseller of that year. It outsold Charles Dickens that year. It outsold P.T. Barnum's autobiography, but it is out of print. And the reason for that is that it was A, written by a woman, and B, it was written as an anti-slavery novel that was kind of strange. The premise of this novel was that white children from the middle-class families in Pennsylvania were being stolen from their families and sold into slavery in Virginia and South Carolina. And so the story follows this little girl named Ida May, who's 5 at the beginning of the novel, and she's kidnapped and beaten until she has traumatic amnesia. And then she finds herself in waking up essentially as an enslaved person. And what is interesting about that story is that the author, Mary Langdon, took what was actually happening to Black children in Pennsylvania and put it onto white children in Pennsylvania, so that hopefully Pennsylvanians who are white might participate in the national fear around the stealing of children and selling them into slavery. And the story, you know, the little girl grows up as an enslaved person. It's basically 12 years a slave, except from the perspective of a 5-year-old girl. And, you know, at heart of it is the danger that her her sexual autonomy will be breached, essentially, is the big thing, because it's a very Victorian novel and they're very concerned about her purity. And I think it's one of those things that we need to consider in terms of how Sumner wants to play this. He is saying that Mary, this little girl that you see here, is another Ida May, which means that she was like a kidnapped child and not somebody who was raised in a family that had been enslaved. And also, she's not been kidnapped. She still has a very large and loving family. Her grandmother, Prudence, who we see in this photo here, was enslaved by the same family, and they all stayed as a family unit in their transition into Boston and worked as a family unit to make sure that all of the members of the family would benefit from any financial gain that was seen by Mary's publicity. and make sure that everyone in the family was manumitted and transitioned up to Boston, which is the second half of my book, which I'll talk a little bit more about. What's fascinating to me at this moment, again, to go back to the encounter, is what Charles Sumner could have done differently in this moment. This is what I'm saying is one of the first photographic poster children of American culture. And immediately he's lying about her backstory, and he's utilizing her race or the fact of her whiteness not to talk about the taboo of sexual enslavement, but instead to talk about the fact that she doesn't deserve or should not be enslaved. And then he's hoping to appeal to white sympathy. He's hoping that the white audiences in Boston will be more amenable or more interested in talking to this child than perhaps to her brother or her little sister Rebecca, who we don't have photographs for and we don't know much about, except that all of the 180 pages of depositions that adjudicated her freedom suggest that she also presents as white. So I think that when I'm working on this project, I'm often thinking about how little gets talked about in the fragments that I have about Mary that have to do with her actual family life. And so when I first came across this letter in 2006 from Charles Sumner, it was, you know, when you're working on a dissertation, it's like everybody says, you know, the best dissertation is a done dissertation. That's super accurate. You just want to get it done. You want to turn it in. There's 5 people reading it. You want to move on with your life. And I did. But this letter stuck with me because it was a moment in my dissertation where I could say, see, the #1 senator for anti-slavery is straight up using photography in exactly the way we do today. We also find children that seem to be more, amenable or whatever to white audiences in order to get their sympathy and their dollars. And that's a very common practice. So we started doing that from the very jump. And what I'm thinking about right now is, after all of these years of spending with Mary, the thing that was most interesting to me was her family and the fact of her life story, and thinking about her father, for example, who took on the name Henry Williams once he became freed. And he was a fugitive at one point because his owner, who was also his father, was looking for him. And so he hid out with Henry David Thoreau, and Thoreau wrote beautifully about meeting Henry in his journal. And so we have these fragments about his experience, or we have this sentence that Oscar says about what it means to be free. Or we have, for example, an appearance that Mary made in Worcester, Mass, in which they put her on stage with a bunch of other kids and said, which one do you think was enslaved? You know, some terrifying moments. But at that moment of encounter, Thomas Wentworth Higginson wanted to adopt Mary. He fell so in love with her. And I wonder about her a lot, and I think about what her life might have been like after slavery, knowing that she had essentially created the potential for her family's being released from slavery, in part because of her fame. Her fame only lasted about 3 months, at which point, you know, America moved on to the more recent issues, whatever it was. And she slipped back into an anonymous life. She did occasionally pop back up in newspapers or on census records. So I was able to track where she lived in the 19th century and the 20th century, all the way up until her death in 1923. And you know, what we know is that she decided to live as a white woman. Her sister Rebecca made a different decision, and Oscar did not live to adulthood. So we know that they made a decision to join the Episcopal Church and to live in a white neighborhood and to work as a clerk of court, always knowing that if anyone made the tie between who she was as an adult and who she was as a child, that she would lose her apartment and her home and her job. So I think it's an interesting moment to think about how the vacillations of the 20th century really map onto Mary's life story. I think I'm going to stop there. I want to just flip ahead to the last page of my book, which is not an invitation for you to do the same. I hope that you'll read the whole thing. But at the very end of the book, I comment on the issue of silence. And I wanted to talk about that really briefly before I lead over to, before I head over into questions, which is that we have so little fragments about what happened to Mary persist. And in that situation, we historians, or what they used to call social historians, until somebody was like, social just means everyone who's not a white man. So basically, like, the social historian community has a power tool, and that power tool is the micro-narrative. A micro-narrative is a story about a small, insignificant person whose story somehow scales to the larger narratives of history that have been determined to be of worth. And so in this case, Mary scales beautifully. She met senators, her dad hung out with Thoreau. There's lots of extant writing about what happened in the 1850s in abolition and the transition to discussions of race at that point. There's the beginnings of the theory of polygenesis. There's so much that she scales to. But at the end of the day, her story is largely one of silence. In 13 years of looking and reading all of these documents, I never found a single word that Mary spoke herself. So all of that work, all of the story, 280-page book about a child who I follow from her grandmother, her great-grandmother's enslavement in 1809 to 1923, and not a single one of the women for whom this story is written has a single word in the archive anywhere. We don't know what they said. And so I want to just read briefly the last couple of paragraphs and leave us with that silence. Monuments such as this should remind us of the sustaining power of family, of the strength of mothers and grandmothers, and of the bravery of those who choose to be fathers. Mary's story suggests to us a new kind of monument to the past, inclusive of all children who, like Oscar, may only leave behind a single sentence of redemption. I now belong to myself, quote. Date books, notes, and newspaper articles help us take the measure of men like Charles Sumner and John Andrew and Henry David Thoreau, but Mary Williams lived a private life, marked not by words, but by gestures of the family loyalty that she learned from her grandmother, Pruitt. May Mary Mildred Williams' monument be a testament to the abiding value of this experience and what it can teach us about what it means to be human. Mary's silence remains, even now, a cipher of nuance and depth. Hers is the silence of the private woman, the silence of old photographs, the silence of the beloved, the silence of the caregiver, the silence of the oppressed, the silence of those who find a way through oppression, and the silence wrapped in the archive, ready to be given the honor of a hearing. So that's my story. I'm happy to hear any questions or thoughts. I also have things like, I have a daguerreotype that's also the 7-year-old girl that's not Mary. And I thought, since we're home at my house, I would pull it out. If you haven't seen a daguerreotype, I think, here's one. It's kind of hard to see because it's a mirror. Zoom does not know what to do with daguerreotypes, apparently.
Right.
What a strange technological moment I'm having right now. The beginning of photography to its, its moment here. But this is what the photograph looks like in real life, which I've had the pleasure of seeing now at the Massachusetts Historical Society. It's kind of amazing to me that Charles Sumner thought that this little object that he sent in the mail to Boston could have an effect, that could have an impact. And also a reminder that anybody who saw it would have had to see it in person, one at a time, because you have to hold it really close at the light to get it to see, to even see something besides a mirror. And so each person would have had to individually go to the Massachusetts State House and open this up and spend some time looking at it and see their own faces reflected potentially on Mary's face. and think about her. Most of the audience in 1850 would have just read about her in the paper and wouldn't have known what she looked like at all. But, you know, there were a lot of people who sought out that daguerreotype to see what she actually looked like. And I think they studied her face and her features to try and do that kind of weird phenotyping thing where people try to decide what race someone is. They were doing that to these little images. And I think that, to me, is really interesting. And some people actually paid a quarter to get the copy made. So they would get a copy so they could bring it home to their families. And particularly in Massachusetts, where the legislature was meeting, there was a huge area of copy daguerreotypists. This is a copy daguerreotype. It's much cheaper. You can kind of see it. This is not anybody. I don't know who this is. I don't know who this is either. But this is a copy. And, you know, you can tell because it's much cheaper and it's quickly made. And the copies found their way into all these fascinating spaces. Like this one woman, Alver, who I'll talk about, you know, who's in my book, she found one of these daguerreotypes at her dad's house and brought it with her to go and teach freed people in Virginia. And then she ended up marrying a local guy who was also an anti-slavery activist in Virginia. And the two of them had like 12 kids, and all of the women did not marry and went off and to have careers. So I think I like that family a lot. But they ended up being the owners of an ex-plantation. And they found one of Mary's daguerreotypes in that plantation, just like in the drawer there, and in Virginia. And that place is less than 20 miles from where Mary herself was enslaved as a little girl. So it's like a weird little round trip there. Or for example, I've given speeches before where I was in Massachusetts giving a speech and somebody came up to me afterwards and said, "This is going to seem so weird." But she pulled this out, she pulled the daguerreotype of Mary out of her purse and was like, "What should I do with this?" I was like, "Oh my gosh." You should absolutely make sure that gets saved somewhere safe. But you know, there's a whole 280-page book about that daguerreotype now. But she and I met, and she said that she had just bought it on eBay. So you never know. I am going to, let's see, one more thing. I have one more thing to show you before I move on. If you have any questions, start thinking about them and typing them into the chat. That'd be super helpful. This is a letter from Charles Sumner. It's obviously a copy of a letter from Charles Sumner concerning Mary. And I think it's interesting to consider, this is how her story would appear in the newspaper. It was published in about 45 different newspapers. She would have been called the White Slave or a Curiosity. And so it talks about her exhibition, and usually would mention Charles Sumner. I have this photograph. This is what it looks like in the newspaper. So it's like, I don't know if you all can see that, but it's just funny. It's just another little mention right here. This tiny little paragraph is about Mary. And the finding of all of these objects was very much improved by the internet. So now we can search old newspapers. This is another letter from Sumner about her. All right. I think I'm out of talking time. And I'm happy for the last 20 minutes that we had together to answer any questions about you. Oh, thank you so much for that, Rachel. Let me pause I can stop sharing now. Okay.
There we go. Okay, now we should be able to see you better.
I'm having trouble using the chat. Can you hear me?
I can hear you fine.
Okay, great. Here's my question. I have read about a lot of these generations of women, of children, who actually, after several generations, looked white, like Thomas Jefferson's children.
Yeah.
And yeah. And I was wondering, in Mary's case, how many generations of white fathering, I can call it fathering, but whatever, how many generations of impregnating the women of Mary's family were there prior to her birth? Do you know how far back that goes?
I do not. I thought, it's funny because I thought you said bothering, not fathering.
Both.
I thought that was an interesting euphemism because it is essentially, it's a rape, right? So these men were raping people that they owned over long periods of time. And it is in some way bothering them. And I think it's, one of the things that's interesting is that, as we all know, from our own families and families, and just kind of how race shows up genetically in families, what a family looks like is not necessarily going to be determinate about how many generations they go back. But in the 19th century, that was a really important piece of information because how many generations of whiteness you have determined the language that was used to talk about you. And that language is deeply problematic and super racist, so I'm not going to talk about it here. But I will say that we are familiar with this idea of people having multiple generations. And one of the things that was concerning, certainly when it comes to Mary's family, is their generational inheritance of having had ancestors who were raped by white men meant that their light skin put them in line for that to continue happening because of various issues about who or what men wanted at that time. So there's a weird problem there. And that also shows up for Thomas Jefferson, Sally Hemings being the half sister of his dead wife is, I think, an issue here. Mm-hmm. But it also is the fact that men who impregnated the Black women that were enslaved to them, they oftentimes did not hang out with the same person over time. So it's hard to track it even in that respect. What's fascinating for me about Mary's story in the archives that I went into to discover more information about her is how much claiming is happening around these children. So, for example, the executor of the estate who owned Prudence, who is Mary's grandmother, had a 40-year relationship with Prudence, that he forced her to bear 6 of his children and claimed all of them publicly in the record so that I could find it all these years later. It was that common. It was that pedestrian of an issue. When we come to the realization of how widespread this issue is, I think it would be remiss of me to speak of it in any other way. But one of the things that comes up a lot, for example, in Ancestry.com is people being concerned about finding out backgrounds. We still have a hierarchy. We still have a racial hierarchy that in this country, and in a sense of like what comes up in these, in like say, for example, in Ancestry.com about how many generations somebody was enslaved, and how and whiteness and all of those things, that's still coming up all the time. So I think what I guess I should say here is that we know, for example, that Letty, who was Mary's great-great-grandmother, was also light-skinned, and that her daughter Prudence, who we see in the painting, presents as white, and her daughter, Prudence's daughter Elizabeth, presents as white, and Mary presents as white, as well as her daughter, as well as her sister. And so I think at that level, we should make assumptions about Letty's past. This would have been in the late 1790s, was a similar pattern of abuse. That said, if someone is carrying a gene that means that their skin color is lighter, that could be carried even if not necessarily this is continuing. But we do know that, for example, the person who owned Prudence was bothering her, and also Elizabeth, her mother, had a husband who was dark-skinned, but who was, he left the family to go and try and escape to Boston to try and free everyone, which he was successful in doing. But during the time that he was gone, Elizabeth and her children were all sold to a notorious slave trader who was trying to get them old enough to get to a coffle to sell to New Orleans. So I think there's probably a lot of history there too. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Other questions?
That just covered a lot of my questions.
Great. You know, one of the things that's interesting for me is that a lot of the people who owned Mary are the woman who purchased Letty was Constance Cornwell, who was essentially what they call a middling woman at that time. She did not have very much property. She was illiterate, and she was widowed. But as a widow, she could buy and sell her own property, and she chose to purchase Prudence and Letty. And when she did that, she became the owner of their children in the future. But she did not have any male slaves on the place at that time. And so most of the people who are born to her family are the result of rape from the men who lived in the neighborhood. So the father of the next generation is going to be the executor of her will, who is a lawyer who lived next door. And so if we think about like what that means, it's like it's not even always a domestic issue. A lot of times it's just roving rapists wandering around the labor camp that was Prince William, Virginia in the 1840s. And if we think about what that means for the women in this situation, they're trying to figure out how to best manage their situations and to keep the family together. For me, Prudence is a real extraordinary hero. Even though we don't know much about her, we do know that she was able to manage keeping her family intact, keeping her grandchildren close, moving the entire team of 20-something people up to Boston, then working for the Underground Railroad, making sure everyone has what they need. And I think that to me is a kind of, that's a real moment of heroism that maybe is overlooked here. Once Constance Cornwell dies, she leaves her family's wealth to her oldest living son, who is a boy who at this time is 16, and he is Black, which is a complicated thing that comes up in the book. His mother is Constance's daughter, and his father is one of the enslaved men on the place. And so sex between people in all generations, all different directions is happening. We don't know what John's father was thinking, obviously, in that situation. Maybe he's manifesting a death wish, or maybe Kitty forced herself on him, or we don't really know. But at a certain point, we're talking about sex, and that is an illegal thing at that time. And so John inheriting Prudence is an interesting moment, because John is a Black man whose father has been sold, and his mother has disowned him, and his grandmother has just given him the property of a very large and growing family of people who present as white. And he's trying to go into court to maintain that property, but he also is actually interested in freeing that property once he gets to a certain point in his life. And he can't, because the courts are not recognizing him as fully human, and so as a fully citizen of DC. And so it's just a fascinating problem that they get tangled up in, that takes the work of their senator to untangle. Yeah.
Oh.
The thing it's always the case that whatever story you have, a micro narrative, if you keep digging, it's going to be something. There's not really there's not a floor here. It's turtles all the way down. And when we get there, we recognize that each micro-narrative has value because each micro-narrative, like for example, the story of Prudence and her, and the teenager who's forced to somehow figure this out, that's an amazing encounter that also is worth the time to consider.
That's fascinating. I mean, I suppose things like that continue in today's world, but it's amazing to think that things happen like that back then, because you think of these kind of Victorian morals that supposedly existed, although we know that didn't even exist in England, that was a complete farce. But it's just so incredibly complicated, and race complicates it so much more.
Mm-hmm. It's true. It's true.
And to consider it all as property, all these people as property, is just mind-blowing.
The scale of it is part of what I think people don't always take into account. And by account, I mean literally, like in terms of dollars and cents. We're talking about 4 million people. The largest economy in the 19th century by far was in people. And they're worth billions of dollars. Mary herself was likely worth $50,000 to $60,000 at the time in which she was freed. And you think about John giving up that future, that financial future for his own family, so that this family can have a life that is in Boston and the future that they have. But it's just so much money, you know, and we follow the money, but every institution that you look at, in this city for sure, but actually everywhere, has some financial basis in slavery at some level. And there's just no getting out of it, you know? And so we have like this responsibility to think about what the truth of that is. I'm surprised at how many people are unaware of sexual enslavement. I'm surprised, giving this tour, how many people are still unaware that women also owned slaves, or that women were raped while in slavery, or that children were enslaved. All kinds of misinformation still persists. And that, to me, is truly a failing of the United States in general. And as somebody who, you know, I've done some research into my own background, and I think one of the things that's coming up a lot for me is, as a white person giving this information, I feel like it's important to continue saying, I am saying this as a white person, because I'm largely speaking to other white people about our ignorance and the continued ignorance. And so it's just something that I appreciate everybody who's taking the time this morning during hurricane prep to sit with a story that is maybe a little uncomfortable. And it's definitely something that I have made a choice to do in my life. But I think every time I look out over a crowd of people who've chosen to spend time with this story, knowing that it's a really difficult story, either, you know, in terms of thinking about a history of oppression, if you're coming to this story as a Black reader, or if you're coming out to this story as a mixed race reader, or if you're coming to this story as a white person who maybe needs to educate themselves in the 19th century. It's commendable, that work, and it's important.
I think that we're getting much more in tune with the fact that the American education system is so white biased. And I know that many schools are trying to change that and to change the curriculum, but it's happening so slowly, which is amazing, because it's the information is, not that the information was never there, but it's just becoming more accessible, I suppose, in today's the internet and with the way technology has moved, that it's so frustrating how slow the change is happening in schools. It's good that it's happening, but not all schools. And it's a push certainly in the more conservative areas, but it's so pronounced how white biased the education system is and the history that it teaches.
Yeah. I think we need to pass HR 40, which is the Truth and Reconciliation Act. so that it's a national conversation all at one time. I think asking individual institutions or schools to do it will always be piecemeal.
Right.
I think what they were able to pull off with 1619 was great, but you see now people are going against it. Like, I think there's just, there is a storm surge that accompanies this information of resistance. And I want to just, I want to name that and think about, like, it's hard because individuals have to do the work individually that should have been done nationally, and it should have been done, 100 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we're grateful to do some of that work today with you.
Thank you. I appreciate your time. Thanks, y'all. I'm sorry I can't see all of you.
Any other, here we can change this from gallery, or
yeah. Well, I wanted to say that if you have a copy of the book that you want signed or anything like that, my friends at the Blue Cypress Books would be happy to help you out. And obviously you can reach out to me directly. My name is also my email address. So I'm just gonna put it in the chat. If you can see it, you are welcome to reach out. It's on my website as well. So let me know what you think.
thank you so much for joining us. We all
Thank you, Rachel.
a few people reached out to me that they had to leave early, but they also commented how much they enjoyed it. So
thank you. And stay safe, everybody.
Yes.
You too.
Bye, everyone. Thanks for joining.